March 18th, 1964, Hazleton, Pennsylvania, a coal town 80 miles north of Philadelphia. Around 1 in the afternoon, a man named Arthur Robinson is out near an old strip mining pit on the edge of town, giving his teenage nephew a driving lesson. Something down the slope catches his eye. For half a second, he tells himself it's a doll someone threw out. It isn't. Quick thing before we sink into this one. If solved cold cases are your thing, this channel exists for exactly this. So subscribe if you want more, and tell me where you're listening in from tonight. This case also ties back to one we told a few weeks ago, in a way I promise is worth waiting for. For now, let your eyes settle, let your breathing slow, and let's go back to Hazleton. Hazleton in 1964 smelled like coal smoke and cold air. The kind of town where the church bells actually meant something, where a family's name traveled the length of a street before the family themselves ever did. Carmen Chiverella ran a small grocery there, the little market. The bell over the door probably worn smooth from 30 years of hands. He and his wife Mary raised 5 children in the rooms above and around it. Ronald was the oldest, 16. Then Carmen Marie, 13. Barry, 11. Marise, 9. And David, the baby of the family, just 7. Marise was the 3rd grader at St. Joseph's parochial school, small for her age, shy in the particular way of a kid who watches a room before she says anything in it. And by every account her family has given since, she already knew, with the strange certainty only a child can have, that she wanted to grow up and become a nun. A whole life quietly mapped out at 9 years old. Let that settle in you for a second. Let your own shoulders drop along with hers. The next day was the Feast of St. Joseph, and the nuns at Marise's school were marking it a day early. She wanted to bring a gift, canned goods carried up from her father's shelves, and set them down before morning mass with her own hands. So she left the house a few minutes ahead of her brother and sister that morning, just to give herself the extra time. The cans probably heavier in her arms than she expected when she was a block from home. It wasn't far, 5 or 6 blocks, less than half a mile. The kind of walk a Hazleton kid could do half asleep. More than one neighbor along the way opened a door and offered to let her step in and warm up for a minute. She said no each time. She had somewhere to be, and she meant to get there. Sometime around 8:10 or 8:15, a neighbor watched her cross toward 4th Street, walking east, moving with that particular seriousness a 9-year-old gets when she's decided something matters. That's the last time anyone has ever been able to confirm seeing Marise Chiverella alive. Back at the house, nobody thought much of anything until lunchtime, when her chair at the table stayed empty. Her father assumed she'd been kept after for something, one of those small school things that happen. When the early afternoon came and went, and she still hadn't walked through the door, he went to St. Joseph's himself. Her teacher told him the one thing he wasn't prepared to hear. Marise had been marked absent all morning. Nobody at the school had laid eyes on her at all that day. That same afternoon, out past the edge of town, Arthur Robinson steered his car toward the old coal stripping grounds. The kind of scarred, rutted-out land locals use for hauling off trash nobody wanted in their own yard. His nephew practicing the pedals and the wheel beside him. Something at the bottom of the slope didn't sit right. He got out. He walked down to look closer. It was Marise. Roughly 2 miles from her own front door, in that isolated pit near the airport, alone in the dirt and the cold. Her wrists and ankles had been bound with her own shoelaces. Her scarf had been forced into her mouth. Close by, still gathered where she'd apparently set them down, were the canned goods she'd been carrying that morning. The coroner's findings were plain and terrible. She had been sexually assaulted, struck, and ultimately died of strangulation. I'm going to leave it there, because tonight isn't really about that hour. It's about everything Hazleton did and refused to stop doing for the 58 years afterward. At the scene, investigators worked as carefully as 1964 knew how. They poured plaster into tire tracks pressed into the dirt and let it set. They found a scrap of discarded insulation that had caught a single clear footprint, and they bagged it like it might matter someday. It would take decades to find out whether it did. For now, they logged everything, filed it away, and kept looking. Marise was buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery, where she still rests. And Hazleton did what small, tight towns do after something like this reaches all the way into a family everyone knew. Doors that were never locked started getting locked. Parents who used to watch their kids from a porch started walking them the whole way. Her family has said, in the years since, that they still hold so many precious memories of her, and that the particular quiet she left in the house never really filled back in. Over the years that followed, more than 230 Pennsylvania state troopers would touch this case in one way or another. Early on, something caught investigators' attention. A high school basketball team from Bristol, Pennsylvania, had played a game in Hazleton the night before Marise disappeared. 18 months before that, back in Bristol itself, a 9-year-old named Carol Ann Doherty had been killed, found inside a church she'd stopped at on her way to the library. Investigators checked the alibi of every Bristol student who'd missed school that day, and every fan who'd made that drive alone. Nothing ever tied the two cases together in the end. Doherty's murder remains unsolved to this day, a separate grief that never got its own answer. Closer to home, 2 men drew real, serious suspicion. One of them owed money at the little market and had been told not to come back. He walked into a police station on his own and confessed to killing Marise, and then unraveled his own story in the very next breath, claiming he'd strangled her with his bare hands. Investigators already knew that wasn't true. She'd been strangled with her own shoelaces, a detail they had never once let slip to the public. The other man never got the chance to explain himself at all. The night before he was scheduled to sit for a police polygraph, he drove out, alone, to that same stripping pit where Marise's body had been found. He parked. He let the engine run in the closed, cold car until the fumes did what they do. By the end of 1964, the case file already ran past 6,000 pages, thick with names that led nowhere, and neither lead had moved the investigation an inch. Wherever you're lying right now, take a slow breath in and let it out even slower. None of this is yours to carry. It's just a story, and you're already safe. Here's where this case does something I genuinely didn't expect when I first started researching it. In March of 2004, a man named Harold Paddock came forward with a theory of his own. He believed his late ex-father-in-law had killed Marise, and he believed the same man had killed another girl entirely, a 12-year-old named Mary Teresa Simpson, taken off a street in Elmira, New York, just 3 days before Marise, roughly 200 miles away, strangled, left in the woods. If that name means something to you already, it should. It's the case we told you a few weeks ago, right here on this channel. Nothing ever came of Paddock's theory at the time. No evidence ever tied his ex-father-in-law to either girl, and the idea just sat there, unproven. One more loose thread in 2 case files that both refused to close. But we know something now that Paddock never could have. Because we already told you, in detail, exactly who killed Mary Teresa Simpson. And it wasn't a man with any connection to Hazleton at all. 2 girls, 3 days apart. 2 entirely separate men who never crossed paths, tied together only by grief, looking for a pattern that wasn't really there. Sometimes a case doesn't connect to the one sitting next to it. Sometimes it only feels that way for 20 years, until the DNA finally, quietly, says otherwise. The years did what years do to a case like this. Carmen Chiverella died in 2006, never once learning who took his daughter from him. It was his death that pushed Ronald to ask the state police whether modern science could finally do what 1964 simply hadn't had the tools for. In 2007, the crime lab went back through Marise's clothing, still carefully preserved after more than 4 decades in storage, and found a viable semen stain. From it, they built a full male DNA profile and loaded it into CODIS, the National Criminal Database. From that point on, every single month for over 10 years, the system quietly checked that profile against every new arrest in the country. Every month, the answer came back the same. Nothing. Marise Chiverella died in 2014, still without an answer of her own. In 2018, state police partnered with a company called Parabon Nanolabs, whose whole business is reading raw DNA and predicting, statistically, what a person might actually look like. What came back described a white male, likely dark hair, hazel eyes, ancestry rooted somewhere in southern Europe. In 2019, 3 sketches went public, imagining him at 25, at 40, at 60. About 30 tips trickled in over the following months. Every single one of them dead-ended. Let your eyelids get heavy here if they want to. This part of the story moved slowly too, for years and years. There's no rush to any of it, least of all to your falling asleep. Eric Schubert had been doing genealogy since he was 10 years old. First the way a kid picks up any hobby, then as something that started to feel closer to a calling. By 18, he'd already helped crack a cold case of his own, the first college student anywhere credited with doing that. In 2019, Marise's DNA profile had already gone up on the genealogy site GEDmatch, and it had returned exactly 1 match in the whole system. A 6th cousin, distant enough to be almost worthless on its own. Early in 2020, sitting in his own dorm room, Schubert came across the Chiverella case in his research and found he genuinely couldn't put it down. He reached out to the troop's public information officer and offered to help, entirely for free. What came back wasn't a simple yes. It was an interview, held over coffee at a shop near his campus in Elizabethtown, where Schubert showed up with a printed resume and case studies of work he'd already done, like he was walking into a job that didn't officially exist yet. Corporal Mark Barron checked him out with other departments before agreeing to anything at all. One of them told him plainly, Eric Schubert's the real deal. Schubert chose one single branch of that sixth cousin's family tree and followed it patiently all the way down into a large Italian family with roots in Weatherly, a small town just outside Hazleton. From there, it became Baron, Trooper James Quiros, and Schubert, going door to door across an entire extended family, asking near strangers to give up a swab of their own DNA for a murder that happened before most of their parents were even born. Every so often, the three of them would regroup, lay out what they had, and decide together where to knock next. More than a year into that slow, door-to-door work, the tree finally narrowed down to a single family, 4 brothers. A DNA sample from the one brother still living cleared his entire branch in an instant. Another brother had been cremated years before, so investigators tracked down his widow, and somewhere in her house, tucked away the way these things are, she still had his old hairbrushes and a razor. DNA lifted carefully from those bristles excluded him, too, and that left one name that had never once surfaced in 58 years of looking. James Paul Forte. When Corporal Barron pulled his record, something jumped out immediately. In 1974, Forte had been arrested in Hazleton for abducting, beating, and sexually assaulting a woman, though never convicted. The woman who survived it would later describe the encounter to investigators, decades on, as violent in a way she never forgot. You can let go of that name already if you want. You don't have to hold on to anything tonight. Just let the rain keep going and let the rest of this come to you slowly. There was still one problem. Fort had died in 1980 at 38 and left no children behind to test against. So the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office secured a court order, and in January of 2022, on a cold morning at St. Joseph Cemetery, Fort's body was exhumed. Cemetery workers strained against the rusted outer casing of his casket until it finally cracked, just slightly, and something small and silver slipped through the gap and dropped into the dirt. A crucifix. Lieutenant Devin Bertosky later said, on camera, that in that moment, it felt like a sign they finally had the right man. On February 3rd, the lab confirmed it. Forte's DNA matched the profile pulled from Marise's jacket back in 1964. Exactly. Investigators said the odds of that DNA belonging to anyone else on Earth were so vanishingly small that with roughly 117 billion people having ever lived, you would need to search about 4 million planet Earths just to find a single duplicate. Forte had lived his entire life in Hazleton. He was a military veteran and later tended bar in town. The kind of regular, familiar face nobody ever looked at twice. He had no known connection to Marise or her family. None at all. He was 22 years old the morning he killed her. After the announcement, a Hazleton woman named Gina Donahue Connors came forward with a memory she carried around for decades without ever fully understanding it. As a child, she'd been approached on the street by a man in a white car who offered her a ride and simply wouldn't take no for an answer. Following alongside her until she broke into a run and ducked into a nearby grocery store to get away. When Forte's photograph hit the news in 2022, she recognized him instantly. The way your body remembers a threat long after your mind has let it go quiet. It wasn't closure, she said, but knowing who it had been mattered. State police announced it all in Hazleton, standing alongside Marise's surviving siblings under the camera lights. Ronald told reporters that given how persistent the Pennsylvania State Police had been across every decade of his own life, his sense was always that, somehow, some way, they were going to find the person responsible. He passed along something their mother Mary used to tell the family, long before she died, that having Marise, even just for 9 years, had still been a blessing. Her sister, Carmen Marie Radke, said their parents had taught them hate was never the way to go. And that lesson alone was what carried the family through everything in between. Schubert, 20 years old by then, standing at the same podium, called it probably the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. Investigators called it the 4th oldest cold case in the country, ever solved through genetic genealogy, and the oldest one in Pennsylvania. More than 230 troopers had touched it at some point across the decades. Inside a file that eventually ran past 6,000 pages. The man responsible had been dead for over 40 years by the time anyone finally learned his name. This case has since been told twice on television. Once on Cold Case Files, once on Bloodline Detectives, which tells you something about how deep it cut into one town's memory. Amanda Chrisman, a reporter who covered it locally for years, put it simply in one of those interviews. Hazleton doesn't forget. Hazleton protects its kids. There's something worth sitting with now that both of these stories have finally been told on this channel. Marise Chiverella and Mary Teresa Simpson never met. They lived 200 miles apart in 2 different states and were taken 3 days apart in the same cold March by 2 men who, as far as anyone has ever proven, didn't know the other existed. For 20 years, one investigator's theory tried to draw a line between them anyway. Because grief does that. It looks for patterns, even where none exist. Because the idea that something this senseless might connect to some larger, findable shape can feel gentler, somehow, than the alternative. That it was simply one man, alone, in one town, on one ordinary Wednesday morning. In the end, both girls got their own answer, decades apart, through the same kind of science, and neither answer had anything to do with the other. Sometimes that's what closure actually looks like. Not one tidy explanation that ties a whole region's grief into a single bow, but 2 separate ones, each true entirely on its own, arriving on its own timeline to 2 families who never knew each other either, and probably never will. Eric Schubert didn't stop after Marise. He graduated from Elizabethtown College and now works full-time as a forensic genetic genealogist. And he's since helped identify the people responsible for other cold cases, including the murders of Lee Rotatori and Edna Loffman. He said this case remains one of the proudest moments of his career, not because of any headline, but because of what it finally gave her family after 58 years of simply not knowing. Marise's case, in the end, came down to a jacket kept in evidence storage since 1964, a DNA profile built in 2007 by people who had no idea if it would ever matter, a facial prediction in 2019 that convinced absolutely no one. A widow's forgotten hairbrush, a crucifix falling loose from a crack in a casket on a cold January morning, and a 19-year-old with a laptop and a genuine desire to help, working for free out of a dorm room because he thought he could. None of it needed a single dramatic twist. It needed a lab willing to check a database every month for over a decade, and one college kid willing to spend 2 years on a case that was never his to solve. A 9-year-old girl carrying canned goods to her school on an ordinary Wednesday. 58 years later, that's still the only part of this story that matters. Everything else, the DNA, the family trees, the coffee shop interview, was just Hazleton refusing to let her go. That's where we'll leave it tonight. You've spent this stretch of time somewhere far from your own bed, and now it's time to come back to it. Back to the quiet of your own room, your own breathing, slower now than when we started. There's nothing left to solve tonight, just the rain against the glass and the low fire burning down to embers, and the dark, patient and warm, ready to carry you the rest of the way. Rest now. Comfortable. Safe. Let go completely. Good night.